It's my great delight to introduce to you again Erin Farrell-Rosenberg, Senior Fellow at Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights, who will be chairing our final roundtable of the day today, assessing avenues for UN engagement on the atrocities against the Uyghurs. Thank you, Erin.
No. Now can you hear me? Yes, okay. Well, good evening, and I think this is going to be a very interesting and thought-provoking panel. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, which is Sarah Brooks. Sarah joined the International Service for Human Rights in 2015. Previously, she had worked with the United States State Department. Most recently, she has authored a briefing note on China's footprint in the United Nations Development, Economic, and Social Affairs arms. Sarah.
Thank you. Are we good? There. It's great to be here. Thank you so much. I will be very brief. For those of you who don't know, the International Service for Human Rights, or ISHR, is a small NGO based in Geneva, dedicated to connecting the work of activists on the ground to the UN human rights system, particularly in those cases where avenues for domestic remedy are few or, as we unfortunately so often see, none. I want to welcome first the comments by the other speakers, as I understand it, that we'll be hearing very shortly, but also reflect on our keynote speaker. I couldn't have said anything better regarding the treaty bodies and the work of CERD specifically. But among all the defenders and networks we support, whether they're focused on China or on other countries, there's another UN mechanism that consistently comes up, recognized as a critical avenue for drawing attention to violations and providing support to victims and their families, and that's the UN System of Special Procedures, the independent experts. Why is this? So Special Procedures 101, in general, their functions are quite extensive. They send information about allegations to governments, analyze laws, undertake country visits, provide technical assistance. They issue press releases, they draft thematic reports. In all of this, they're exceptionally open to civil society and see their role to be, as is often noted by the UN, the eyes and ears of the Human Rights Council. More importantly, these experts carry out the functions without regard to any state's legal obligations, without asking permission, except in the case of physical access, and without needing a formal mandate to focus on a specific country. When it comes to the Uyghur region, we've seen public and private letters on disappearances, including in the context of camps, bilingual education, lengthy prison sentences, counterterrorism, de-extremification, gender-based violence against women detainees, and forced or coerced labor of Uyghurs. So pretty much covering all of the issues we've spoken about at this conference. As our keynote speaker mentioned, on 26 June 2020, more than 4 dozen of these experts spoke out with respect to China more broadly, pressing the Human Rights Council. And in this, I think it's important we specify the actors, the UN member states who are member states of the Council, and the Council Secretariat and Bureau, to, quote, act with a sense of urgency to take all appropriate measures to monitor Chinese human rights practices. Xinjiang was consistently and substantively addressed in their statement. Yet by and large, more than a year on, nothing has changed. Not only have legitimate concerns fallen on deaf ears, they've elicited a rapid, and I would say rabid, response from the Chinese government and CCP officials. So what can be done? Without discrimination for other mechanisms or the suggestions raised by speakers earlier today, and those we'll soon hear, I'd like to propose 3 options for stepping up the work with the special procedures, and key questions as to whether and how they could be feasible, desirable, or the greatest litmus test, impactful. So first, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Since at least 2019, in their opinions on China, they've included a really important but easy to miss statement. They recall, and I quote, that under certain circumstances, widespread or systematic imprisonment or other severe deprivation of liberty in violation of the rules of international law may constitute crimes against humanity. This has gone largely unremarked, So I would ask, could we envision taking this at face value and urging a referral from the working group in reflection of the fact that the vast majority, some 90 to 95% of the cases they consider, they do in fact deem arbitrary. Second, the Working Group on Disappearances has been incredibly responsive in adapting to the changing landscape of deprivation of liberty in China, from RSDL to foreign nationals like Li Mingzhi and Gui Minhai, to passing on dozens of humanitarian requests from the Uyghur community to the Chinese state. They've made repeated appeals for access to the country and have not been invited. But I would argue they shouldn't stop there. What is the cost-benefit analysis by civil society? What could we think about as the possibilities for pushing the working group to take an effort to report on the country anyway? They can do this. It's in their methods of work. Why haven't they? And what might we do to push them in that direction? I'll sort of skip down, I think, on time. Oh, great. So 2 very short additions. I did want to note that not all special procedures are created equal. This is particularly true in China's eyes. So how might we expand leverage and, importantly, combat Chinese narratives by seeking statements and engagement by experts who are working on issues that China sees as wins: development, poverty, international solidarity? Would this be an alternative appeal for middle ground, non-Western states? Would this give us another framework for trying to push for concerted action? And then finally, in 2011 and 12, there were a handful of cases of Uyghurs at risk of refoulement that were taken up by the special procedures, addressed not only to China, but also to those states where the claim was made, namely, for example, the Netherlands. Could a clear assessment by the Special Rapporteur on Torture that any Uyghur is at risk of refoulement actually drive not only domestic asylum determinations, but critically, more responsive and nuanced policies by UN agencies such as UNHCR? So I'd really welcome recommendations, discussion on all of these, as well as the question I hinted at earlier, which is really what can we collectively do, all of us here in this room and on this call, to ensure that the results of this work don't simply end in a so what, but in fact that they set the bar higher, that they create both a foundation for future work and, for many of the governments, a little bit more cover for doing what is so urgently needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's an excellent start to our roundtable. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Ewelina OCHAB. Dr. OCHAB is the program lawyer with the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She is the co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response and is an advisor to Archbishop Angelos, among other politicians and thought leaders.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And all organizers for putting this very important event together. Of course, there's a lot of information about the atrocities against Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but there is no mechanism to proceed with the information and to take steps towards securing justice for the victims and survivors. And currently, there is no UN mechanism with the mandate to collect and preserve evidence of the atrocities being perpetrated against them. While some evidence is being collected by researchers, NGOs, it is not clear whether the evidence will be collected and stored in a way that it would be possible to use it in future proceedings. And of course, reports also suggest that some of the existing databases are being attacked by hackers in an attempt to destroy the evidence. And there are several mechanisms through which the UN can act, including at the level of the UN Security Council, General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council. In the cases of Bosnia and Rwanda, the UN Security Council established a commission of experts to consider the available evidence, collect further information, and prepare an opinion to confirm the nature of the atrocities. And once the commission of experts confirmed that the atrocities in those cases amounted to genocide, the UN Security Council passed resolution establishing ad hoc tribunals to prosecute the perpetrators. Another example is, of course, in 2017, in response to the Daesh atrocities, the UN Security Council passed a resolution establishing the investigative team tasked with collecting, preserving the evidence of the Daesh atrocities in Iraq. And of course, over the last few years, the investigative team has been collecting the evidence and working with proceedings in 14 different states on ensuring justice for the atrocities. However, where such an action is not possible through the UN Security Council, and of course China falls within this bracket, other UN organs have stepped up. For example, as the UN Security Council was infamously blocked on every meaningful action on the situation in Syria, predominantly because of Russian and Chinese vetoes, in 2016, the UN General Assembly established the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria, so-called IIIM. The resolution establishing IIIM was strongly opposed by Syria. However, it was adopted by a recorded vote of 105 in favor, 15 against, and 52 abstentions. And since its creation, IIIM has collected a significant amount of evidence and has been collaborating with 12 jurisdictions to enable domestic prosecutions based on the principle of universal jurisdiction. And lastly, similar investigations and evidence gathering mechanisms have been established by the UN Human Rights Council, most notably the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar in 2018, and more recently, a mechanism for Sri Lanka in 2021. As such, the UN organs reflect a significant legacy in establishing mechanisms to collect and preserve the evidence of such atrocities. While states have been calling for unfettered access to Xinjiang, and China has been delaying it, it is crucial to recognize that a mechanism for evidence collection does not depend on access to the region. Indeed, as is clear from the examples of IIIM and the mechanism for Myanmar, while these bodies have not been granted access to the region, they have been doing this work remotely and ensuring that a step towards justice is being taken. A UN mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of atrocities against the Uyghurs is the next crucial step, and one that cannot be postponed. And without securing the evidence now, the prospects of justice in the future are zero. And just following up on what Sarah mentioned in relation to reporting, monitoring the situation, I would say that we need to take one step further. Rather than just monitoring and reporting, we need to secure the evidence now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ewelina. Next, we're going to hear from Nicola MACBEAN. Nicola is the founding director of The Rights Practice, an NGO supporting those working for human rights in China. The Rights Practice has published 2 reports on the situation in the Uyghur region, one on gender-based violence, and a recent working paper on the use of criminal proceedings. Nicola.
Thank you very much. And thank you particularly to Joe and Hannah and the team for bringing this conference together, finally. So it's great to be talking about sort of our engagement with the UN. So I certainly echo the comments of some in the previous panel that it's very much not an either or, and that we really need to be finding ways to be engaging with the UN in a whole number of ways. And I wanted to focus my brief remarks this afternoon on engagement on the issue of development and the idea that we should be engaging on the situation in Xinjiang in the context of the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We should be engaging on the substance of the SDGs, as well as with the development community of UN agencies, other international organizations, development INGOs, and researchers. As China is using the language of development and its achievements in reducing poverty to deflect criticism of what's happening in the Uyghur region. And we've been hearing many reports of this in the last 2 days. And China has been reasonably successful in this. Its comments are gaining traction with a number of countries and international organizations. But at the same time, many of China's most deeply concerning actions, from coercive family planning to population transfers, involuntary factory labor, security measures. These are all intimately bound up with its development policies in the Uyghur region. In a recent speech, a Chinese diplomat explicitly linked its counterterrorism policy to development successes. So I think there are three principal reasons why we should engage on this issue. First, we should interrogate China's own claims, particularly on poverty alleviation, more closely. Its poverty benchmark of $2.30 a day for rural areas, for example, is well below the $5.50 the World Bank recommends for an upper middle income country like China. And second, China's state-led development model is divorced from human rights. It is not the kind of human rights-based approach to development that the SDGs promised. Many of China's development policies are coercive. They involve individual targeting, which is highly intrusive and involves extensive surveillance, as we know. Third, China's development model, including in Xinjiang, is being promoted internationally through development channels via the Belt and Road, via financial relationships with other countries. And this alternative model is risking undercutting international consensus on the more ambitious and human rights-based SDGs. And I think there may be also strategic benefits. So although the SDGs do not have the same accountability mechanisms as human rights law, they are globally agreed and apply to all countries, including the UK. They provide an additional way of framing what is happening in Xinjiang along lines that are important to China, a point that Sarah has also made. The SDGs provide an entry point for bringing in other UN agencies, UNDP, UNICEF, etc., development ministries around the world, as well as INGOs. I believe there's also an opportunity here for the UK government if it is really serious about upholding both human rights and being a development champion. So the SDGs are not an alternative to human rights accountability, but I think attention to this third pillar of UN cooperation may allow us to build a wider support for holding China to account for its human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Next, we're going to hear from Arsalan SULEMAN. Arsalan is counsel at the law firm of Foley Hoag in Washington, D.C. He represents the Gambia in its case before the International Court of Justice against Myanmar for the Rohingya genocide. He was the acting U.S. Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation at the U.S. State Department during the Obama administration. Arsalan.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Erin, and thank you to Joe and Hannah for organizing, and also to Sarah for alerting me about this conference. Hi, Sarah. Good to see you. Sorry I couldn't join all of you there in person, but it's been really great to listen in on the proceedings. I know that other speakers have talked about the treaty body mechanisms before, and that's what I wanted to focus in on a little in my remarks here, my brief remarks, because I think of all of the mechanisms that can create a real focused fact-finding product and legal investigation and examination of what's happening in Xinjiang. I think the treaty body mechanism through the CERD, the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, is really the most clearly available mechanism, and the one that holds perhaps the most promise for creating a type of accountability platform that can be really used to unite civil society and state efforts to address the atrocities happening in Xinjiang. So, you know, the CERD Convention has an interstate complaint procedure which provides a unique mechanism to hold China accountable to its CERD obligations via a UN-sanctioned multilateral dispute resolution process that would feature an independent fact-finding body composed of experts. Any state party to the CERD Convention can bring an interstate communication, which is sort of a type of complaint, against another state party to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or the CERD Committee, which is the treaty body created under the CERD Convention itself. And such a complaint would allow the CERD Committee to receive evidence and later appoint what's called a conciliation commission, which would then issue a report with findings of fact and recommendations to the CERD Committee. And that report ultimately would be shared with all states party to the convention, which would then add to the body of credible international reporting and fact-finding on this matter, but also increase the international scrutiny as to the atrocities in Xinjiang, and also create a focal point for international action. This CERD procedure has been very infrequently used. For 49 years, in fact, it went unused. It was used for the first time in 2018 by Qatar when it filed complaints against the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia during when those states had engaged in a discriminatory blockade of Qatar, and that was one of the mechanisms that Qatar had used at the time to try to challenge those actions and the impact that it had on the human rights of Qataris. And I had the honor and pleasure to work on that representation as well. But that effort by Qatar has demonstrated that the CERD committee process is a viable one, and it's one that would be available to any state parties that wanted to bring such a complaint against China. It would take a little bit of time in terms of going through the actual steps of the process. But given the challenges that other speakers have already discussed in terms of having action through the UN Security Council, or even the UN political bodies like the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, I think this action has particular advantages because it doesn't require a resolution. All you need is one state party to the CERD to file this type of complaint. And it doesn't have to be one state, because I know in discussions with many states, there is this concern about going it alone, so to speak. It can also be filed in a group format. You can have more than one state file a complaint. But the point here is that the mechanism is available. The mechanism would result in the creation of a conciliation commission, which would then be mandated under this treaty that China has consented to issue a report with findings of fact and recommendations for action. And I think the main benefit of that is that you've got this very clear platform that is readily available. All it takes is the political will of one or more states to do it. And it can create a focal point for a lot of other actors, including civil society actors, but more importantly, perhaps for victims to have a voice, because the testimony of victims could also be submitted to this type of conciliation commission in terms of its fact finding. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to go into that process in a little bit more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arsalan, for explaining the process under the CERD. That was very interesting. Next, we will hear from Baroness Helena Kennedy. She is the director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, a lifelong barrister, and of course a champion, well known, of civil liberties. She is also a member of the UK House of Lords. Baroness.
Arranging this conference, which is vitally important at this time. Let me just tell you that over the last few years, I've become engaged with the issue of the Uyghur population in China. Because once I became the director of the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association, one of the first things that happened was I started to receive letters from women because of my reputation as a human rights advocate for women about their experiences in the province, and shocking accounts. And indeed, I then made contact with different people and met with some of those women and expanded my interest in the whole area. As a result, I've since become very, very preoccupied with what is happening there, accelerated, of course, by China's conduct in relation to Hong Kong and that sense of sort of stretching of the authoritarianism. I mean, many of you are too young to have this historic perspective, but there was a moment in time where we did think that China was moving to a very different place. But unfortunately, under the current leadership, that's changed. One of the things that has happened in the last couple of years is that we have created in Parliament, and as Erin has mentioned, I'm a member of the House of Lords, and so we always look for legislative opportunities to raise issues as well as by asking questions and so on. And one of the things that has happened is that it became recognised that it was going to be very difficult to persuade the British government as a single entity to take on China. And so we've created an interparliamentary alliance on China, and that now includes some parliamentarians from the United States, cross-party from Canada, from different states within the European Union, Australia's included, Japan, and I co-chair it here in the United Kingdom with a member of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan Smith. Now, the other thing that we've sought to do in Parliament is raise this issue about the responsibility of states with regard to human rights atrocities, with regard to potentially genocides that are in action. And as we know, the convention, and you've already been discussing all these matters throughout the day, but as we know, the Genocide Convention puts a duty on states to prevent genocide. So it's not about having to sit and wait until it's over. The determination that we should be acting in advance really requires us to start monitoring from an early stage whether we think that certain behaviours and conduct towards minorities may in fact be leading towards even greater atrocities. And so we really aren't hearing enough, I feel, from the United Nations about that duty on states to monitor, and that we have that responsibility ourselves. Recently, Lord Alton, a great human rights champion in the House of Lords, came together, and I have to say with the great help of Ewelina OCHAB, who's been a stalwart on this, but with a number of other distinguished international lawyers, we've put together an amendment which was with regard to the trade bill, which was to say, if we're going to be trading with the world, and of course Britain is anxious to do that, having come out of the European Union, then of course advancing trading opportunities is very much on the agenda. And so we wanted to say that trading, of course, should be sought. However, it is contrary to international law to trade with a genocidal nation, and we should be taking steps to ensure that we're not doing so. That received a great deal of parliamentary support, even in the Conservative Party, which has a huge majority, and it was lost by a very small minority, that attempt to put an amendment into that trading bill. But one of the things that I want to go back to is that the United Nations, and we have to be sensible about it, it requires states to bring these matters to its attention. And so we, as Arsalan was saying, and as Ewelina and Sarah, others have said, we really have to put the pressure on the UN, and we have to get our states to do that. It's going to be hard to get an individual state to take on China, even with regard to creating what one, as a lawyer, one would think was a very sensible and simple thing, which is if there's allegations being made, then you need evidence, and evidence has to be gathered, and therefore there has to be mechanisms for doing that. And we've seen that there are ways of doing it. Arsalan and Ewelina have described them in greater detail. And we should be stepping to that next stage, which is creating that formal way of collecting evidence, which may in fact not involve going into the country. We've got a similar evidence gathering thing happening just now in Belarus, there are ways in which you can do that externally by hearing from those who have suffered the consequences of some of these human rights atrocities. So I strongly advocate that we as parliamentarians engaging with civil society, we have to start calling for some of these steps to be taken by our nation, calling upon the UN to create the sort of fact-finding expert body that can gather the evidence and archive it in a way that is safe and secure so that it can eventually be used if a time can ever come to call people to account. But let me say that there are other things that can be done with a country like China, which is very conscious of shaming and conscious of the ways in which it can be undermined. It's very important that the evidence gathering is a way of actually reminding the world of what is happening and what is contrary to our expectations of nations conducting themselves according to international law.
Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. Just to repeat, thank you very much, Baroness, for that very timely intervention. Our last speaker is last but most certainly not least. It's a reprise of the previous session, and hopefully we're going to hear even more interesting things from what you've already shared with us. Stephen Kinnock is the Member of Parliament. I know that he doesn't really need an introduction, but would feel odd not doing this. And also the Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific.
Well, very much indeed, and apologies to everyone that you're having to hear from me 2 sessions in a row. I don't know what you've done to deserve that, but there you are. I was absolutely fascinated to hear about the different routes and channels that exist, from IIIM to what's happened with Sri Lanka to the Myanmar example and experience, and the SERG committee as well, which I have to admit was something new for me. So I've really learned a huge amount through this panel, and I think that these are really important inputs. And just rewinding quickly to the discussion in the last panel where I said I think we're kind of reaching a fork in the road. There is no reason why we should have to take a binary choice here, and that probably fork in the road is therefore not the right analogy to use. But what I am a bit skeptical of is that these alternative routes are ever going to come to anything. And that, I think, is the challenge that we're facing. Is I think we just have to be hard-headed and realistic about the political realities of whether or not we're ever going to get to a position where any of these alternative routes that go through UN channels are ever going to become a reality when it comes to what we're talking about today. I fervently hope that I'm wrong. I fervently hope that the international community will, because as everybody has said, it has to be state-based. You know, if you can drive your car to that fork in the road, but it's the states that have to drive the car, and then it's up to states to work effectively to get things to happen in the UN, clearly not through the Security Council, but through all these workarounds. I'm just a bit skeptical about it happening. And that's why I thought the genocide amendment to the trade bill that Baroness Kennedy so rightly mentioned and others did in the previous session was such an attractive proposition, because it actually enabled British courts, take back control, as some people like to talk about, to take back control and to take action that wouldn't be mired in the quagmire of the politics of the United Nations and all of the challenges that entails. So I am absolutely up for pushing all of these routes and workarounds and channels as far as we can possibly get them to go. But we come back always to the fundamental issue around political will and whether or not we have states that are prepared to operate in a plurilateral basis in order to effect change in a multilateral way. So that, I think, is the fundamental question that we're grappling with. And in addition to the routes that have been mentioned, we've, of course, got Human Rights Council's periodic review process, which I think offers real opportunities. We haven't talked about the ARIA formula, so creating informal channels, or perhaps we did. I'm very sorry if we did and I missed it. That may well have happened. I probably shouldn't do 2 sessions in a row in that case, but if colleagues did, but it would be useful to explore whether the ARIA formula can be convened by any member of the Security Council. Why doesn't the British government do that? More support for the International Criminal Court, campaigning more actively for a British judge on the ICC. Ad hoc tribunals play a critical role in terms of upholding the rules-based order. We also, though, have to confront the reality about the increasing control that China has over the UN and its agencies. If you look at the way in which China, or effectively proxies for China, have now secured so many of the senior positions across the United Nations. So we've got to find a road back from that. We need a coordinated strategy. I think a senior official should be appointed in the FCDO and counterpart ministries across all of our democratic partners to really get a strategy to map out, okay, what are the next big positions coming up in the World Bank, in the WHO, in the UN, in all of the agencies, and how are we going to ensure that there's at least a competition? Because for over the last 10 to 15 years, we've not even been on the pitch in terms of allowing China, in essence, to position itself and to secure all of those senior roles that are so important. I think we need to as well make some direct representations to Secretary General Guterres. Let's not forget that the United Kingdom was the first country to come out in support of Mr. Guterres, so we should be using that as leverage, and I'd like to see the British government doing that more effectively. So I think it's as everybody has said, we do need to be pushing all of the buttons we can possibly push. I'm afraid that I am quite skeptical about these uniquely multilateral routes. There has to be a plurilateral approach, but that needs political leadership from countries like the United Kingdom, particularly given our permanent seat in the Security Council. You know, why can the British government not propose an ARIA formula meeting by the end of next month? I see no downside to doing that. So there's lots of tangible and great suggestions that have been made. I just think we need to be very realistic about the politics of this, as well as the multilateral channels that are open to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes, okay. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of our panelists for your opening remarks. I would just, as maybe a little point of privilege, say that having worked at the ICTY and also at the ICC, the United Kingdom's successful nomination of Judge Howard Morrison is something I think that the UK should be very proud of. Judge Morrison has served excellently, certainly as the presiding judge in the Karadich case at the ICTY and then in the appeals chamber. And so having had the honor and pleasure of working for him, I did just want to mention that. And more judges like Judge Morrison would indeed be very good at the ICC. With that said, I am not, while I'm a lawyer, I'm not a prosecutor, but I'm going to play one just for a moment and pick up on, indeed, Stephen's point and ask a rather pointed question, if I can, to Arsalan and Ewelina. So let us assume that a UN mechanism, like either a fact-finding mission or a treaty body, is properly mandated or invoked, and they do issue a report, as both of you have referred to, on the atrocities, and it is a damning and strong report with evidence, victim testimony, etc. What then? Arsalan, you have mentioned some of the values of having a report. Ewelina, you have mentioned as well some of the values of collecting the evidence, but this only gets us to a certain point. And so the question is, can you then address what is the concrete change that you would see from these processes at the end? And as Stephen has alluded to, how likely is it that we would actually move beyond a report as the end product? And maybe I think maybe Arsalan, if you would like to begin.
Erin, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, thank you. I mean, that's a key question. And I think one thing to recall in terms of what we could expect or what we could hope for after a report is sort of the process that went into the case, ultimately led to Gambia bringing its case against Myanmar at the ICJ. So we all knew even before the UN fact-finding mission's reports in 2018 and 2019 that what was happening in Myanmar were horrific atrocities, certainly crimes against humanity, possibly genocide. It wasn't until the UN fact-finding mission report, I mean, many civil society organizations and reporters engaged in really significant work. And of course, the victim testimony coming out of the camps was really harrowing. And so I want to give credit to all of those actors who helped to bring to light the situation. But really the UN fact-finding mission report, when it concluded that there was sufficient evidence to find genocidal intent, that really helped tip the scales for a number of actors. And I think it was certainly important for the Gambia in terms of the Gambia to consider all means that it had at its disposal to bring some sort of accountability action. And ultimately, those UN reports by the fact-finding mission were critical in laying the foundation for the Gambia's case against Myanmar under the Genocide Convention at the ICJ. Now, as other speakers have mentioned, China has a reservation under the Genocide Convention and other similar mechanisms. So we don't have exactly the same jurisdictional hook to be able to do that. But what I think we could hope for and what I think we could envision is that if we do ultimately have a similarly damning report, which I think would be the result if we were to be able to get either a UN mandated report through a resolution or through the third mechanism that I discussed, where you could, through a complaint to the third committee, you could launch a process that enables a conciliation commission of 5 experts in the field to engage in findings of fact and making recommendations. If that report comes into existence, then I think you would have, much greater, a much greater gravitational force around which you could coordinate actions by multiple actors in order to put pressure on China regarding the situation and their actions in Xinjiang. And that would include key evidence and key findings that could support enhanced levels of sanctions that states, sorry, echo now. Yeah, enhanced levels of sanctions that states could impose on a bilateral basis or acting multilaterally. It could also create a tipping point for potential multilateral action, and that could include creating mechanisms like a special rapporteur for ongoing reporting on the situation at a body like the Human Rights Council. But I think it would further empower national legislatures as well and the parliamentarians. I'm so glad we have so many MPs who are here it could also empower national legislatures to enact further restrictions on corporations that are doing business there in order to match the executive sanctions that can be imposed with further restrictions on how business can be conducted. So, I mean, I think the difference would be that if you have that kind of report from an independent body with the UN sanction, it changes the calculation to a great degree for many actors who would then have further leverage that could be brought to bear on the situation.
Ewelina, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, including, of course, once we collect and preserve evidence of the atrocities, we would like to see this evidence then ending up in court, very clear. And of course, ad hoc tribunal, that would be one of the options. Unfortunately, the only UN body that can actually establish an ad hoc tribunal is the UN Security Council. And of course, there, China could easily veto any such attempt. So this is a no-go. The ICC, of course, there's an attempt to ensure that the ICC has the jurisdiction over the situation in China, and I'm sure that we'll hear about this attempt in due course as more evidence is being sent to the ICC in that case. But I think we need to also move away from just focusing on criminal justice and of course, the other benefits of collecting and preserving this evidence. And I think there is definitely a lesson to be learned from, for example, the Commission of Inquiry report from 2014 on the situation in North Korea. And I just very recently had a call with Justice Kirby, who led that Commission of Inquiry. And of course, there was always some disappointment that we did not follow up on the recommendations from the report. Many remain unanswered to this day. However, there were certain elements of this inquiry that were beneficial and wonderful on many different aspects. Among them are, of course, the public hearings that gave the opportunity to victims and survivors to have their quasi-day in courts and tell their stories. And that was the first time that their stories and their pain and suffering was not being silenced. And so I think there is definitely this very human element to this process that we cannot undermine. It plays a very important role in the whole process. But also just few very brief examples of the importance of such reports produced by the UN. And the first case is of the Daesh atrocities. And in 2016, the Canadian Parliament debated whether the atrocities amounted to genocide. And at that stage, the response was the same as in the UK. It is not for parliamentarians, it's for courts or UN bodies to make such a determination. Few days later, a UN body published a report called "They Came to Destroy," and that report recognized the atrocities against the Yazidis as genocide. And few hours later, the Canadian government recognized the atrocities, citing that report. So again, this is very important. And of course, it was not only the recognition. The Canadian government promised to send investigators to Iraq and to ensure that they collect further information, and offered also resettlement for Yazidi communities. So this is the very important element of it as well. And one more example, of course, as I already mentioned, IIIM and investigative team. Both mechanisms have been doing wonderful work, collecting, preserving the evidence. And then, of course, at this stage, especially in the case of Syria, it's very unlikely that there will be any kind of ad hoc tribunal, because again, it has to be established by the UN Security Council, and there Russia and China would most likely block such an attempt. But at the same time, this investigative mechanism has been working with investigators from different countries. IIIM has been working with investigators from 12 countries to ensure that they can use this evidence and prosecute the perpetrators using domestic courts in those countries. And the same happened with the investigative team. They've been working with investigators in 14 countries. So even if we cannot ensure international criminal justice, there are other ways that we need to explore. And if we are able to collect, preserve the evidence of the atrocities in Xinjiang, maybe not tomorrow, next week, next month, in the next 5 years, but there will be, sooner or later, there will be an opportunity to explore different avenues to ensure justice for the victims and survivors.
Thank you very much. And I see that the Baroness has her hand up. Just before I turn to you, Baroness, I would just say, to echo what Ewelina said, I think that the other example we should think about is Sudan, where we do need to be aware that it may be unlikely, but we also can't predict what happens in the future. There are, in moments in time, such as in Sudan, where you have a regime change, a moment where justice can be activated. But the example of the ICC and what has happened with Bashir potentially being transferred required that all of that preliminary investigative and evidence gathering was already done, and that there was an arrest warrant, which then took almost, well, more than 20 years before it was acted on, but now is actually able to be acted on only because, as Ewelina said, those steps were already done. And when that moment came, the court was able to act. So just as one additional example to add, without further ado, then I would ask Baroness, I know that you would like to intervene as well.
But of course he's right. Of course he's right in his reservation that that we will ever see Nuremberg-type trials or anything of that sort. And it may be that that's not what we should be aiming for. I think that we're coming to understand that justice can take many different forms. And one of the things that Ewelina has just said is one of the things close to my own heart. Many of the people who will never see individual justice for the wrongs that are committed to them. But you know, when you look at the atrocities and the crimes and violations and sexual violations in conflict, particularly against women, those women never get their stories told, and they often do not become part of the nation's history or of the world's history. And so there are reasons why having evidence gathering and public evidence gathering, it can be vitally important. And it also is a way of getting civil societies to understand what's going on and to hear those stories. It's also a way of shaming nations that have been involved in them and the leadership in those nations. It also gives a stepping stone when there's a new administration in places to say, we're making a change, we're going to do things differently. And so I really don't want us to dismiss those opportunities because they will not lead to the conventional notions of that it ends with some form of old-fashioned trial. It may be something different. I also want to say that I don't want us to see us going down when we're talking about the fork in the road, and Stephen sort of said he didn't want to see it quite like that, is that I don't want us to enter into another Cold War. And I feel we're tripping towards that. And I think that we have to start thinking about, why is it that China is doing this? You know, it's not, is it that they're all a terrible, nasty crowd of people? I know many Chinese people who are fine and good people. And so what is it that's causing this? And of course, you know, there was a time when, you know, let's just think about the business of different peoples. Most nation states are made up of many different peoples. And that you have to evolve ways in which you embrace those, and some of them are about trying to beat people into becoming the same as the majority. And for others, it's about, which is, I think, the more mature way of doing this, is to recognize a devolution, recognizing that people can be sort of autonomous, but within the wider nation state. And so that you have sort of federal systems. And it may be that in diplomacy, one could be persuading China that because the Uyghur want to have their identity maintained and so on, that's not very different from we Scots, I say this as a Scot, you know, wanting to maintain aspects of our being which are distinctive and so on. And I'm not saying that as an advocate of independence, but I am saying it as an advocate of strong devolution and ways in which peoples can retain their sense of identity underneath the umbrella of a whole. And I think better diplomacy, better conversations, and the UN can be a convener of that, but you also need a stick in there, which shows that there is displeasure about the breaches of international law and standards of humanity and compassion and understanding of each other that is fundamental to peace and justice in our world.
I'm going to now turn, I think we have about 10 minutes left in this session. I'm going to just ask Nicola, if I can, a bit in the same manner. You talked about using the UN SDGs as a helpful frame, as a different way to engage with China. And I'm wondering if you could address whether there are challenges or risks to discussing development issues with China with respect to the Uyghur situation in the Xinjiang region.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I suppose I was putting forward the idea of engaging on the SDGs, you know, as a supplementary strategy, really, to the work that all of us are doing on the sort of more conventional human rights sort of line. Because I think part of it is also trying to build up more allies, build up kind of more people who will take a critical view, I mean, amongst other countries. However, yes, engaging on this issue, I think there's a reluctance to criticize China from these both from UN development agencies, but also INGOs and many countries, to criticize China on its development approach. Largely, I think, because of sort of a feeling that China has achieved a lot on poverty alleviation. Now, we can critique kind of exactly how and why, but it definitely has. And when you've got big sort of number targets, previously with the Millennium Development Goals, but even, you know, with the SDGs, you know, China's achievements kind of matter globally. Obviously, this is particularly the case, I think, for those agencies that are based in China, have operations, I mean, in China and including, you know, INGOs that are present there. I think there's also going to be a bit of a reluctance around, and I think there's some confusing thinking around the sort of, you know, do we criticize China when we want its cooperation on things like climate change? And I think we really need to think this one through a lot more, because, I mean, it certainly shouldn't be, you know, climate change is, and engaging in that is in China's interest. It's not something they're doing to sort of, you know, do us a favor, really. And I think we really need to be much more robust in a lot of these conversations with China. I guess, yes, there are going to be challenges about getting access to data, the usual sorts of things, but I still have a sense that this is an angle, this is bringing in a group of additional stakeholders, a way of talking about things that actually China, the way, you know, and the question was about, you know, also, well, why how is China you know, why is some of these things happening in Xinjiang? I mean, part of it is driven by their understanding of development and modernization. And I think if we can also challenge that discourse with a much stronger sort of human rights-based approach, I think we would, you know, maybe take a small step in undermining their case.
I think you really brought together your point with what Baroness Kennedy just pointed out of sort of understanding really where China's coming from and how we can still within that build in this respect for identity, culture, et cetera. And I see that, sorry, I had a question for you, but I think you wanted to jump in on this question.
I did, but I'd be really curious to hear what you wanted to ask. So maybe I can do two in one.
Why don't we do that? It's not going to be surprising, but I'm going to take what you said and ask you to defend it. So you talked about how we can think creatively of using the special procedures. And I want to ask you, given that, in fact, the independent experts and UN special procedures have raised the red flag, have commented on the situation of the Uyghurs, and it hasn't necessarily resulted in anything. So I wonder if you can address what are the limitations of the special procedures that, just in terms of expectation management, people should be aware of, and are there ways to address the limitations that exist in terms of this?
So a lot of thoughts, and I really just wanted to thank all of the members of the panel for the really robust discussion, and I think one that cohered really well, Erin, thanks to your management of it. Maybe I'll start with thinking about where, Nicola, you just left off, which was a bit about, how can we think about approaching things perhaps from an understanding of what is motivating China. And I think the one caveat and the one warning I would have is that, quite a lot of the concern around development is also that what is motivating China in this is its ability to export the development model that it's presenting to other countries as part of, I think, a much broader effort, and Mr. Kinnock, you also raised this, of profiling themselves across the multilateral stage. And so if we assume that that is also part of the motivation, then we have a really clear imperative, I think, to confront those development issues despite the potential risk of co-optation of language or of being seen as soft, or of acknowledging perhaps wins where we might otherwise not want to. So I wanted to kind of make that point. I focused on the special procedures because if we kind of map things on a spectrum of where we really, really need political will from states that is thus far not materialized in ways that we would want, the special procedures are perhaps at the far end of the spectrum in that states have virtually no call at all on what these guys do. I mean, there's some discussion that we could have about funding, and I think in the talk of mechanisms, especially in the standing up of mechanisms, where that money comes from is going to ultimately be a big question we all need to confront. Special procedures, it's the same thing. But in the day-to-day work and in what is already mandated, they can do whatever they want, kind of. And they have, and that's precisely why China's targeting them. So I think that's a really important note to say, not that we shouldn't be pushing our governments, all of our governments, to be taking actions and pushing the UN structures as such to do so, but that at the same time, on a much shorter time frame and without needing to confront that question of political will, we can also be thinking about these creative ways of pushing beyond the bounds of what special procedures are comfortable doing, and thinking about the ways in which that, again, provides us this basis of where do we get evidence, how do we get ways of reframing for different allies, and then, ultimately, how do we give victims a voice?
Yeah, if I could just come in, because I think this fundamental question has been raised about what is it that's motivating the Chinese Communist Party now and President Xi at this time in 2021. And I agree absolutely with what Helena said, that the last thing we want is another Cold War, but I think that that's not on the horizon for the simple reason that China is so deeply integrated into the global economy in a way that the Soviet Union just never was. So that decoupling, I don't think, is on the horizon. But what I do think is that there's a deeper emotional motivation for President Xi, and that is about avenging the century of humiliation. He is absolutely clear that China was the victim of colonial powers from the mid-1850s until 1949, and until those crimes that were committed against China, in his view, and in some cases I would agree with him, but the reality is that he will not rest until he has reunified Greater China as he would define it. It breaks my heart to say it, but the job is more or less done with Hong Kong. The next moves are clearly with Xinjiang, Tibet, obviously, and then, of course, we have to look at Taiwan. So I think we have to be absolutely clear-headed about this, and that's part of the deal that was done with the Politburo to make him president for life, is so that he could buy time to achieve this historic mission. I think we have to be absolutely clear-sighted and hard-headed about what is motivating China under Xi Jinping, and it is about avenging the century of humiliation.
No, thank you for that. I think that was really critical. And I apologize that we are running out of time. We are now going to, however, turn to the audience for a couple of last questions. questions, if we could.
So I'd like to address my question to Mr. Suleiman, because I was struck insofar as your introduction of a case where you could mobilize other states, where there would be a recourse available. Of course, there is the case in which you are involved, and there is the ability to mobilize other states. And so my question is, what is preventing the Gambia, and I recall on the 24th of September 2019, the Vice President of Gambia announced at the United Nations they would proceed in the case and invited other states to join them. I think that was literally what she said. What is preventing Gambia simply now calling upon other states to join the case, as many have asked, also to ask the court explicitly, potentially even with the National Unity Government, to make public the reporting under the provisional measures, which would give that kind of public exposure, or asking the court under, I don't remember if it's Article 34 or 50, to appoint a commission of inquiry, for example. So one could do many things, is what I'm saying. And it appears that there's passivity at the moment.
Thank you very much for a really fascinating panel discussion. I would just like to pick up the last point that Stephen McKinnock brought up about the century of humiliation and how it plays in, and connected to the panel before that you were also part of. So maybe a bit provocatively, I would just like to ask, in the sense of maybe creating a global network of mass atrocity prevention, what prevents, for instance, the UK government from recognizing that the Opium Wars were a terrible atrocity committed against the Chinese population, and then maybe using that to move on to pushing China much harder on Xinjiang, especially if, as you say, we are all going to stay engaged with China economically in the future, and disengaging is not really possible. Thank you.
I have one more question from someone on Teams. How do I get? I don't have that up. Sean, are you? There you are.
So I just had a question as to why, or whether, I guess, issues related to the rights of indigenous peoples would be another avenue through the UN through which to engage. In particular, because I see this as the critical issue related to development. I don't think the discourse on development should be necessarily through the Sustainable Development Goals, but should be related to the UN's policies with regards to development with indigenous peoples. And this also gets to the question of, is there a resolution to this that would allow the Uyghurs to have more autonomy within a Chinese state?
Question. The microphone agreed. Okay, I think that with these three questions, the panel agrees. I would first ask Stephen if you might respond to Rune's question. Then I would ask possibly Arsalan and the Baroness if you might want to respond to Sean's question. And then Arsalan, if you could also respond to Professor Packer in that. And then, of course, the other panelists are also, then we'd love to hear from you. But this is the last round of questions. Stephen.
Something poetic about the suggestion that you made, and I I love poetry, so I would certainly support the principle of what you've said. But in terms of the sort of hard-headed realpolitik of it, I think that, you know, Xi Jinping and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party have made a big political and big geopolitical decision. They are committed to it. They have a project. I do think it's about promoting an ethno-nationalist vision of China. I think it is about promoting a geopolitical project which certainly includes Taiwan. And that is going to be the biggest geopolitical challenge that the world faces. The Chinese Communist Parties are a Marxist-Leninist organization that makes a basic calculation about power and has come to the conclusion, I think, that the scales are now tipping in its direction, and certainly looking at the moment at which they become the world's biggest economy will matter a lot to them in terms of where, how, when and how they make their move on Taiwan potentially. So if I thought that an apology and an honest conversation about all of the many dreadful things that Britain did through its imperial past, and there's so many other conversations we need to have with ourselves as a country, frankly, about the reality of what the legacy of empire means for us. But where we are here and now is around just being very clear about the emotional drivers and the hard-headed political calculations that the Chinese Communist Party is making as a Marxist-Leninist organization. And I'm not sure they're going to do poetry. I think they're operating in prose, not poetry.
Arsalan and the Baroness after that. Arsalan and the Baroness, if I could just ask if you could keep your responses brief, as this is the last question. Thank you.
Sure, Erin. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I'll just answer John's question. Hi, John. You know, the Gambia continues to be open to having other states join in its efforts in different ways, whether states want to make declarations of a finding of genocide, support the case in ways, or intervening to support the case. I think the intervening is the kind of more kind of the further step that they could take would, you know, to actually become part of the case in a certain way, whether it's intervening as a party to the convention or potentially trying to join in as a party to the dispute. But I think for all of those options, states are going to go through the decision-making process, and certainly to intervene in a case. I think the most likely route would be intervening as a party to the convention. But doing so, I think states probably want to time that in an appropriate way. And certainly if any state is considering it, we would highly recommend that they be in touch directly with the Gambia to coordinate that effort, as Canada and the Netherlands have done. And I know that other states, including the UK, are considering that as well, and certainly welcome that consideration and welcome any engagement that they would like to have with the Gambia as part of their decision-making process. In terms of the reports of the provisional measures, you know, the court has made the decision to keep that confidential, and I hope that the court will eventually make those public. My sense is that the court's normal process of keeping pleadings confidential until a hearing on the merits is held may hold as well, potentially, for these implementation reports. So I think that remains to be seen what the court is going to do. And I think this is a little bit of a new mechanism for the court to kind of keep an eye on the implementation of its provisional measures, which is a welcome development, but certainly understand the need for that transparency element in terms of having greater attention paid to it. And just to bring it back to Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation generally, I mean, I think the third mechanism that was discussed really does create the opportunity for joint action. And I know that Stephen was, you know, talking about the political realities and how it's difficult for a state to do this alone. But I think the third mechanism does offer the opportunity for states to do to file a complaint, a communication as a group jointly. So that mitigates that political burden that a single state might have to take, but it would still yield the benefits of initiating this process, which would lead to this independent and authoritative report, which will hopefully be a focal point for victims to be able to add their testimony, but also civil society to advocate and evidence to continue to be gathered.
Thank you. And thank you very much for that, Arsalan. Baroness, I'm very sorry, but there is a commemoration event which is taking place in just the next, I believe, 5 minutes, and the attendees do need to get to that. So I sincerely apologize for having to cut you off, but we are going to have to wrap up our panel. My sincere thanks to the panel members and to the audience for your time and attention. Thank you.